Okay, hello. My name's Gemma Jerome, and I'm the manager of Building in Nature. So, Builder in Nature, it's the new benchmark for green infrastructure. We've developed and tested this with end users from across the built environment sector. So that includes planners, developers, house builders, construction professionals, public health professionals, and others. We created the benchmark in response to perceived difficulty of delivering high quality green infrastructure. And the different stakeholders have different perceptions about what those obstacles are. But some of the key things that were brought forward in our customer requirements testing were a lack of consistency about what the ask is from local planning authorities when it comes to green infrastructure, which can be frustrating for developers and house builders. There's perceptions that to secure the functions and benefits of green infrastructure, they vary across each stage of the planning process, so from design to implementation and to long-term management and maintenance. And interestingly, in that regard, other assessment frameworks really focused on the master planning stage, so the pre-application. So how do we ensure that those benefits really come through? And then we also wanted to be really clear about defining what high quality green infrastructure is, with the aim of accelerating the delivery of new homes and new places, even in areas of constraints. So places that people want to live, and places which can contribute positively to the management of land for water and wildlife. So that's by way of introduction. Why did we choose a benchmark? There's been a lot of people who've been trying to grapple with the delay in the delivery of high quality green infrastructure. We have a lot of good knowledge about what green infrastructure can do and what it is doing in some places. These are just two quotes that I'm pulling up that I've come across in the development of Building with Nature. So people involved in delivering green infrastructure, we need a tool to help planners. So this idea that there's been a real stripping out of resources in planning authorities. We don't have often ecologists, landscape professionals or urban designers in local planning authorities. So how can they really be the arbiters of those good quality places coming forward? We also need a framework of principles to define what high quality green infrastructure looks like. There's different guidance out there, but how do we pull this all together to have a really clear definition? And then there's also the need to make the business case for green infrastructure. So we started this process thinking that there was a clear need around expressing the value of green infrastructure, so the value at the site scale. And there is some good research out there that RICS and others have done showing the value of green infrastructure. However, what we found when we started talking to developers and house builders is that actually a really critical aspect for them around green infrastructure is that it can help reduce planning uncertainty. So if there's more consistency around what planning authorities are asking for, that can really speed up the planning process and smooth that passage of a scheme through to approval and then delivery. And clearly there's a strong policy driver for this. At the moment, we're really trying to accelerate the delivery of new places and new homes to meet demand. So the benchmark itself, it's the first benchmark for green infrastructure in the UK. There are other, like I say, other assessment systems out there that deal with different aspects of green infrastructure, but this is the first holistic benchmark for the whole framework of green infrastructure. There's 23 standards to Building with Nature, and they cover core standards, which they're looking at what actually is green infrastructure, the fact it's a multifunctional network of connected features, and that we need to think about long-term management and maintenance. So there's 5 core standards, and then there's 3 thematic areas. So they cover well-being, water, and wildlife. And we were able to come up with these standards through extensive evidence review, and we reviewed existing standards, policy and practice guidance, academic literature, and that whole process was to understand what the characteristics of high quality green infrastructure are. So that's about the content of the benchmark, and then in terms of the mechanism itself, so the mechanism was developed through ongoing iterative testing with end users, and we were able to create an assessment system related to those customer requirements by testing constantly with end users. And the feedback we had that we integrated into the development of Building with Nature is that it should be simple. So too often assessment systems can be really complicated, difficult to understand, and even if they are written into policy in local planning authorities, we're not necessarily seeing schemes come forward that meet those those systems and those frameworks. So it should also be flexible, so to allow different levels of award and to be used at different stages of the planning process, and that it shouldn't be overly onerous, because actually what we need to do here is raise the baseline. So rather than just awarding the excellent, it's about making all development better than it currently is. So the Building with Nature covers each stage of the planning process, so it can be used at design and feasibility stage. It's really instrumental in the planning stages. It helps with implementation and securing those functions of green infrastructure by ensuring the features are delivered as they're intended to stay functional, and then that there's appropriate support and resource around management and maintenance. And we also were really conscious that Building with Nature had some meaning and legibility for customers as well. So there's a real customer interface consideration. So well-being, water and wildlife, they're concepts that mean something to everybody, rather than it being a very technical tool. In terms of how the Building with Nature works at different stages of development, it can work for development, delivery of new homes, new commercial properties, and it can also be used for retrofitting existing communities and existing settlements. And it can also be used for policy as well. So Building with Nature provides a set of principles and standards that can be used to certify policy, which is to support the planning authorities and others who are developing policy. So examples there, it could be a green infrastructure strategy. In terms of new development, we could be talking large-scale settlements, urban extensions, but also smaller sites in brownfield areas. We've also considered that there needs to be an incentivization for the industry to want to use this. So we've taken that into account with how the award comes forward. There's also an importance in terms of the existing assessment systems only look at pre-construction. So the clear feedback to us, but this should have an element of post-construction sign-off. So Building with Nature can only be awarded in full post-construction, but there is a candidate status. So the candidate status can be awarded pre-construction to allow the promotion of a scheme, and then full award comes through after completion or at each phase of completion. That then allows us to use Building with Nature to support sales and marketing. So in my travels working with different house builders, there's a kind of emergent understanding that actually people are looking for houses which that are based in a place which has really thought about things like wildlife, things like access to natural green space for active lifestyles, and flood resilience, so thinking about how water management is considered. So there's an opportunity for Building with Nature to help raise confidence in house builders to tell the story of the development in that way. It can also be used to support the discharge of conditions and make sure that each green infrastructure feature that formed a constituent part of a master plan really does come forward through a multi-phase development. Okay, so I wanted to kind of dive down into some case studies to give you a feel for how Building with Nature has been tested in a couple of early adopters. So these are schemes that have already been working with us to develop the standard and have now been certified with Building with Nature. Different types of developments, different scales, and at different stages of planning. So this gives you a flavour. We have, the first one is Elderberry Walk in Bristol. This is a relatively small scheme, still a major application, but it's 161 houses plus green infrastructure. It's a brownfield site, a high-density urban development. So this is really good to show that delivering high-quality green infrastructure is possible in a high-density situation. Also interesting about this scheme is that it has in the tenure mix, there's a majority of the tenure is social rent and ethical rent. So the story to be told here is that there's still a commitment to create a scheme which supports healthy, diverse communities using green infrastructure to reduce health inequalities. And that was really important for the planning authority, which is Bristol City Council here. And there was a triangulation that was possible between the planning authority, who were the landowner until the development came forward, the housing association who were delivering most of the units, and then we were able to support that process by advising on how we'd like to see the green infrastructure come forward. There's also lessons here about the adoption of green infrastructure features. That's obviously it's often seen as problematic, and because there are different housing providers here, there was a conversation that we were able to help facilitate between the housing association and the existing landowner to ensure that the long-term management and maintenance of green infrastructure features was built in at an early stage of development, to ensure that it remains a great place to live for the people living here. The next case study is Elms Park in Cheltenham. So this is a very different type of scheme. This is the largest strategic allocation in the joint core strategy area in Gloucestershire. So that's Tewkesbury, Cheltenham and Gloucester. 4,115 homes, plus employment land and green infrastructure. So it's a significant development at a county scale, and there was a unique opportunity to showcase the potential of large development to contribute to green infrastructure priorities at that county level. So there's a green infrastructure strategy that forms the constituent part of the joint core strategy, and this was a way of delivering against that. It was interesting for Building with Nature to be involved because it's a large, complex scheme. It's volume house builders, so Persimmon Homes and Bloor Homes, who don't necessarily put green infrastructure at the front of their approach to house building, but there was a real receptivity here to realise that there was a lot of win-win that could happen by making sure green infrastructure was part of the design early on. So the feedback from the house builder here was that Building with Nature created a framework of principles which could really support the discussions between the two local authorities and themselves to know what was expected at the pre-application stage. So that story of really smoothing the passage through planning and reducing planning uncertainty to set those parameters at an early enough stage without going into too much prescription, which comes obviously later in detail design. Also interesting about this case study is that the local planning authorities reported back, they suggested that Building with Nature was really supportive to help communicate the benefits of green infrastructure to the elected members who would ultimately be deciding on whether this scheme comes forward for approval. And the last case study I wanted to highlight, this is Chesterton Farm, which is an urban extension of Cirencester in the Cotswolds. And this is different again. It's still a strategic scale scheme, 2,350 homes, and then employment land for and community facilities. Interesting because a real driver of the scheme was to complement the landscape character area, which is in adjacency to the Cotswold AONB, area of outstanding natural beauty. And there was a clear focus from the client here to ensure the multifunctionality of features within the scheme and linkages from the development to the wider area. So not just containing the design process and the design thinking within the red line of the boundary, but thinking how the development can contribute benefit to the existing community. And then you start thinking about, well, how does that help tell the story to the existing community to reduce objections if possible? There was a commitment here to work with planners to enhance the special landscape character, which is highly valued by the existing community. And interestingly, Building with Nature, through the process of awarding the scheme, we were asked to speak at the committee to help champion how important green infrastructure has been in this scheme. And here to tell us more about that is Ben Rosedale. So I'll hand over to him now, who was an important figure in this scheme. And I'll just flash those up while Ben comes up to the stage, but that's me if you want to contact me anymore. Thank you.
Great. Fine, hi. My name's Ben Rosa. I'm a chartered landscape architect, and I run a business called the Environmental Dimension Partnership. We're actually based in Cirencester, where we started the practice about 12 years ago. My practice covers most of what we might typically fall under the umbrella of green infrastructure. We have a large landscape team, ecology team, heritage team, and we also cover matters like public rights of way, agricultural land, and arboriculture. So before the concept of green infrastructure was invented, some say around 2006, when it started to emerge in planning policy, it was very much the flavour of what we were doing as a practice, that collective suite of services. There's about 100 of us on the team, and we've been working almost entirely in private sector, house building oriented work throughout our 12 years in practice. And because of that, I think our involvement with Gemma and the Building with Nature team was able to offer a very specific perspective. Our clients are private sector's house builders. They are the Bovises and the Taylor Wimpeys of this world, amongst a lot of other strategic land developers. And therefore, the way in which we operate as a practice is, of course, has to be, by virtue of what we offer, aligned with the ambitions of our clients. And they're in the business of house building and house delivery, and whatever we might read in the press about land banking and the sinister ambitions of the house building sector, they are ultimately in that business of getting things done, getting houses built. Now, specifically, my practice works in environmental planning. So we're involved in that stage where a client might come to us with a piece of land. And in the instance at Chesterton Farm for Lord Bathurst, he's had some fields on the outside of the town. That was actually 14 years ago. He first came to a colleague and said, what are the prospects? And we planted a lot of trees at that time to get the thing rolling. And lo and behold, sort of 8 or so years later, the thing really started to pick up. But we're involved in that process of looking at land and looking at its development potential. Part of that is to consider the sensitivities of that site. So does it have wildlife sites of interest? Does it have heritage features which might constrain development? We have to look at the planning policy framework, but our role in the process is to manage risk. So what our client is asking us to do in the development process is to look at, specifically in my case, the environmental risks and to mitigate those. So that's one thing we do. But secondly, we're also in the business of promoting sites. So the vision for any given development, large urban extensions, we're working on about 60 across the country of 500 plus units, is a process of also developing a vision for that site. So one of the real benefits I've derived from developing green open structure strategies over the years for my clients is that vision, that narrative, that partly to address sensitivities on site, but has real value in itself. It really creates traction with planning authorities. So long before Building with Nature, an original scheme I was involved with at South Worcester, it's about 2,500 units again. The Wildlife Trust up there had some money from DEFRA to run a pilot project on the concept of green infrastructure. And that whole concept of what green infrastructure is interesting in itself. It means many different things to many different people, which probably its largest Achilles heel in planning policy terms, because no one can actually say what it is. I said this to Gemma the other day. The day a planning authority refuses an application on the basis of lack of green infrastructure, it will actually start to mean something from that point. But anyway, so we were developing at South Worcester this concept. And through this DEFRA funding, we had the very rare opportunity of actually getting in a room all the people who might have a view on green infrastructure. We had the Forestry Commission, the Wildlife Trusts, we had Natural England, we had the open space officers, we had the rights of way officers, we had the ramblers, we had all sorts of people, all the people in 3 authorities that this site covered. So 20 plus people in a room, something you never get on your average scheme. But we were able to develop a strategy together. We were able to work through the sorts of issues that affected the site. And we were also able to look at how we might promote this site, going above and beyond what planning policy specifically developed, to improve our clients' chances, in my case, my client, the strategic land developer's chances of getting this site allocated. And really, when it comes to value, that is what the house builder will often be looking for. It's both the value for the end product, the sale to the consumer, the house buyer, but it's also how developing a narrative around green infrastructure as a cohesive subject area can manage the risk in planning and progress a site positively through that process, as opposed to the more often scenario we have these days, where schemes are fought tooth and nail to the last endpoint. And so with that scheme at Worcester, we were able to get that through committee with no environmental objections whatsoever. And with the scheme at Chesterton, through working with what became Building for Nature, Gemma and the team there, we were able to show that this scheme offered above and beyond what a scheme would normally do simply to address environmental, ecological constraints and open space standards, to develop a whole vision which included character areas across the scheme. The commentary provided by Building with Nature was read out at Planning Committee not a month ago, and the thing sailed through. It gave a huge amount of support. And the more case studies I have of that kind, the more I can take these sorts of awards and concepts across to developers and say that this is something that is positive to engage with. I've had real successes recently down in Plymouth, where I'm promoting the largest urban extension of the city on the northern side, directly facing the national park. I've done a lot of work with the council around this concept of green infrastructure, a interlinked and multifunctional green space, which addresses a whole raft of constraints relating to the site, in combination with a country park that goes above and beyond. But it's that vision we created collectively that has added a great deal of value to the site by reducing the planning risk for the client, by putting the site in a position where it can go through planning with a great deal more certainty, because it's that lack of certainty that really hurts the developer. So in terms of value, I think there are two key areas that an award or a certification can deliver. The first is value in planning, in managing risk. I think Gemma referred to it as planning uncertainty. That's where I really see the value and able to promote an award such as Building with Nature, because by putting an independent body who recognises that a lot of developments have great green infrastructure potential, these sites, and are able to deliver on that potential, to see those celebrated in the planning system is of great value. The second point of value is at the sales end, and there's a different crib sheet for that, for the person buying the house. We have plenty of RICS studies that show us an increase in property values by virtue of proximity to open space and its relationship with that open space, something like up to 14% extra. So when they come to sell that house, they're not selling a house looking onto a building site or somewhere where the builders store their plant. They're looking onto an established piece of green infrastructure and can take a real uplift in the value of that property at the point of sale. Now, sadly, these are the guys who build these things, and they have to be engaged on that level of value. Many of them are PLCs. They have the profit motive and have to justify to their shareholders this is the way in which they operate. But as I say, there can be real value at both the planning stages and at the sales end of the spectrum through an award of this kind. So I don't have a great deal more to add with respect to the examples, but just my view of the real benefits that green infrastructure can bring in planning. Firstly is the holistic view of soft environmental subjects. So often, particularly from my practice perspective, we get broken down into dealing with landscape officer to landscape officer, ecologist to ecologist. What green infrastructure does is able us to look at the whole thing, and that enables some really effective trade-offs in planning. We're able to see that partial impacts over here might be more than compensated for through the provision of further ecological resources, for example, associated with suds basins or attenuation basins. But unless you have that sort of holistic discussion and presentation of how green infrastructure works on site as a concept, then you tend to find everything compartmentalized down into its constituent parts, which misses out on a great deal of value. Secondly, it creates a forum for collaborative working in planning, which is a rarity in itself, to get those people, even on the planning authority, working together. It's quite a rarity from their perspective, and a forum in itself generates value and breaks down a lot of boundaries. And lastly, as I said throughout, celebrating the best practice. To me, it's unlikely that a green infrastructure is going to enter planning policy in a distinctly legislative format, whereby you either do or don't address a certain standard. But it is important and increasingly valuable to look at it as an award to celebrate good examples of planning where green infrastructure is truly a positive of the scheme. And who knows, in time, that might lead to planning-related policy. But we've got a lot of work to do in defining what green infrastructure is until we get to that point. And in the meantime, what we need to do is recognise that the development sector these days is generating sites with real positives around green infrastructure, huge swathes. I mean, we probably designing and delivering hundreds of hectares of green space every year on the schemes we're involved with. Very little of it in planning gets recognised for the upside. And I think the award for schemes where it's done properly has real value in itself, particularly in the short term.